Um, so hello, everyone. So today we have one of our own, the wonderful Nicole Mirra. And Nicole is currently an assistant professor, but hopefully not for long, in learning and teaching, former English teacher in Brooklyn, New York City, with 2 master's degrees, one in English Ed and another in educational policy, and a PhD from UCLA, University of California, LA. She came to us from the University of Texas, El Paso in 2017. And we're forever grateful for having her here. Her work brings the fields of literacy and youth civic engagement together in ways that bring about more social change and justice in the classroom and society. Dr. Mirra believes that content should be used as a vehicle to teach students to lift their voices in public life, and she partners with youth as co-researchers in her work and co-designs studies focused on the issues they care about and are consequential to them. She aims to shift conversations in the field of literacy to focus on civic engagement and change. She is a Spencer National Academy's Fellow, multiple publications, and a recent book from Teachers College Press on what it means to bring empathy into the classroom through a more critical and civic way. The book is called Educating for Empathy, Literacy, Learning, and Civic Engagement, and it won the Book Award for Excellence in the 21st Century Literacies, research from the Initiative for 21st Century Literacies Research in 2020. Another little plug is that she is guest editor with Antero Garcia on a Journal of Learning Sciences special issue, which will be out in 2023, titled Other Sons, Designing for Racial Equity Through Speculative Education. And proposals are invited right now. I don't remember what the deadline is, but we're definitely looking forward to that wonderful special issue and all other things wonderful coming from Nicole. And I am going to turn it over to you, Dr. Mirra, to start us off with your talk. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much, Ravi. It's humbling to think that it's been since 2017. I feel very lucky to be here at Rutgers as part of this community, and I'm excited to talk about some of the work. I also want to mention for a lot of the PhD students here, it's very recently, I still have imposter syndrome about what role I could play within the learning sciences. I did not know too much about that field just a few years ago. I'm a literacy scholar. That's where I see my foundational home. And I was very intimidated by the idea of what the learning sciences were and what role I could play within it. So if you're feeling the same way, know that this field is very interdisciplinary. And over the past few years, I've really found a space for us to talk about learning and the role of literacy. It's not just about STEM. It's not just about narrow cognitive approaches to learning. It's sociocultural views, critical views are all being welcomed into this field. So my name is Nicole and I'm a learning scientist. And I'm excited to talk a little bit about the work that I've been engaging in around this area that tries to blend across fields of literacy and youth civic engagement and learning. So there's going to be a lot of times where I'd love to hear from you in the chat, and I'm also happy to take questions anytime. So don't feel like this has to be a monologue. I'm happy to hear from you, and I've got a few prompts built in to ask you to think about some things in the course of my presentation. So let me get this set up here. All right. So the title of my talk for today is I Hesitate, But I Do Have Hope, Speculative Civic Literacies for Troubled Times. And this is the same title that was in the Harvard Education Review piece that was written by myself and my colleague, Antero Garcia. I should mention that a lot of this work of developing the framework of speculative civic literacies is a collaborative endeavor between Antero and I. So one of the things that we're very interested in is tearing down a lot of the assumptions or practices in the academy of highlighting individuals as producers of work. We believe strongly in collaborative scholarship. We believe in love and joy being part of the academic writing process. And Antero and I started working together and became friends when we were both graduate students at UCLA working on our doctorate. So again, for the PhD students here, the cohort members that you are surrounded by, the people you are meeting now, think about what kinds of relationships you could forge that are not only personal, but also academic and creative, that can foster you throughout this time in the academy, because it's been really valuable for the two of us to do this work. Also, I wanted to very quickly talk a little bit about the land that we're living on for several reasons. So I'm an uninvited settler on Lenape land. I'm currently coming to you from Brooklyn, New York. A lot of you are in New Brunswick as well, and maybe coming from other places. I bring that up. I think it's important for several reasons to talk about land acknowledgement. Number one is about respect for the indigenous folks who have been on this land far longer than many of us. I also think it's important to not just have a symbolic gesture of land acknowledgement, but to think about what that really means in our work. And for Antero and I, talking about land acknowledgement and the folks whose lands we are inhabiting is an important move, because it reminds us that the social arrangements in which we are living are not inevitable and are not a given. They are not all that has ever been, and they are not all that ever could be. So that's important for our speculative framing, that the land we are living on and the nation state that we currently live in is not something that needs to be taken for granted or needs to be seen as inevitable. I also wanted to mention the picture on the left is a picture of Amazon, where the Amazon web servers are across the United States. Zoom runs on Amazon web servers. And so I think that digital is also going to be an important aspect of this work. And so at the same time that we think about the land that we might be physically inhabiting at the moment, we also want to think about the tools that we use that allow us to communicate and have a talk like this across time and space, and the ways that those are also geographically mediated, and what role that might play as we think about our work. And you could find more information about the lands that you're inhabiting on this website. So I'm going to come back to this idea of the social arrangements that we have around us are not all that ever could be, because that's going to be important to the speculative civic literacy frame that we've been working on. So quickly, again, I'm a literacy researcher at heart. I'm a former high school English teacher, and all of us have been living through, obviously, a year and a half and counting of a continued pandemic. I'm really interested. These are just a grab bag of some headlines that I've been finding around the news media about the new school year, and about this kind of obsession with the word reimagine as we're coming back to school, even though we are in a continued and not post-pandemic reality. There's been lots and lots of talk about the exciting opportunity that we now have to reimagine education, think differently, reimagine what's around us. A lot of this was sparked when the pandemic first hit. Arundhati Roy, celebrated Indian author, published an article saying that the pandemic could be a portal. So as tragic and as stressful as the pandemic has been, any event like this has the opportunity to perhaps open a portal into a new way of doing things, to truly disrupt the structures that we've had in place for so long. And I think there's an idea that perhaps as we all come back, this form of reimagining is kind of becoming a buzzword and is very much in fashion. But unfortunately, what we've seen for the most part is that amidst all this talk of reimagining, there have definitely been individual teachers, individual young people, individual community members who have definitely used this time to reimagine and to disrupt. But at the system level, especially in education systems, for the most part, this opportunity has pretty much been a lost one at this point. At the same time that we see talk about reimagining, we're seeing that surveillance has been increasing through the COVID-19 pandemic and afterwards. Plenty of stories about the homes of young people, particularly young people of color, being policed by teachers and administrators who are in different geographic locations by looking through their webcams. Standardized testing is back on the radar as districts are looking to kind of measure what has been lost. So again, learning loss that we keep hearing about is a phrase that we use if we believe that what was going on previously was the gold standard and that something has been lost, as opposed to something being gained or something being changed or even something being reimagined. So again, it's very hard to break out of the cycle and the gravitational pull that school systems have upon what we see as normal and what we see as the kind of learning that is valued in our school systems. And I think it's important to keep that in mind. Again, our speculative framing is based on the idea that we need entirely new frames if we truly want to think about what it could mean to take this disruption seriously and move forward toward since the normal that we are trying to return to was never working for all individuals, has always been inequitable and stratified. So we want to kind of think about what it would take to learn differently. What would it take to learn beyond these frames? And I want to quickly show just a 1-minute clip. This is before the pandemic. In the olden days, I went to a talk at BAM, the Brooklyn Academy of Music, which is one of my favorite places on earth. And I was able to see Ijeoma Oluo and N.K. Jemisin in conversation with each other. Both are racial justice advocates and writers. N.K. Jemisin is a science fiction speculative author. Ijeoma Oluo does amazing work about how to talk about racial justice. And they had a conversation about activism and imagination in an unjust world. And I just want to play the first minute of this clip because this still sticks with me from when I was there listening to this conversation.
I've always felt that activism is a very creative practice. And where we fail and where we're most threatened is the limits of our imagination. And especially, I think, for racial activism in a white supremacist world, our imagination is so boxed in by white supremacy that our definition of freedom is even boxed in by white supremacy. And what I'm constantly worrying and fighting against is the limitations, and sometimes it's generational and sometimes it's not, of what we can imagine in the future. And it's so revelationary to me to see this just imagination, vast imagination of the past and the future. And actually to see some of this story play out of like, these are my limitations. Because I'm constantly telling people like, I don't know what freedom looks like. And my grandkids one day are gonna say, why didn't you see this? Why did you stop us here when we could have done more?
Yeah. So I just wanna, I can share this link with folks, and I go back to this conversation constantly. I can constantly go back to those words. Especially that statement, I know that I don't know what freedom looks like. The idea that our imaginations and what we believe is possible in society is hemmed in by white supremacy is something that has been kind of animating what Antero and I have been trying to think about in this work. What does it mean to talk about learning, to talk about literacy, to talk about civic engagement? If what we can imagine as freedom, what we can imagine as social progress, as civic engagement, is boxed in by frames that we have been socialized into for so long that it's difficult for us to even get out of. And so I would love to see in the chat, I'd encourage you to think about this question for yourself. What is this making you think about? What frames might be hemming in our understanding of what is possible in education, in society, in our work, in our research? It's a question that I don't have full answers to, and I think it's a lifelong process of unlearning. But I think naming that and naming the frames that we often use to place value or to frame what is good or what is desirable in society and in education and our research and where those come from, and starting to go down that rabbit hole is an important practice of learning that could also lead to unlearning, which could lead to the kind of futures that could be more equitable and liberating. And that's part of what has been kind of guiding us to think through what this work could mean. So I encourage you to think about the frames that are guiding your work as we go through this and how you might push on them moving forward. And so all of this thought, again, is leading us to this development of a framework that we've been working on called Speculative Civic Literacies. And we just wanted to break down that term a little bit of where it's coming from. So first, the idea of the speculative. We are very indebted to the work of Afrofuturist art and culture. A lot of Afrofuturist work is starting to kind of push into the mainstream right now. You might be thinking of things like Black Panther or Lovecraft Country, but the ideas around Afrofuturism stretch back centuries, really. I've been really inspired lately by a professor at Cornell of literature named Derek Spires. He wrote a book called The Practice of Citizenship and writes about literally in the Revolutionary era, Black individuals' use of literacies to imagine new forms of citizenship and new forms of shared life, even amidst slavery. So like the ideas of using the experience of oppression and using the experience of understandings of enduring levels of discrimination to imagine new worlds is kind of it's a practice that's been going on for a very long time. And there's science fiction blended into history, to speculative, the fantasy, magic realism. And the idea is that we need to think about not only the future in a vacuum, but a future that is informed by our past and a critique of our present. So we're really interested in what it would mean to think about not simply educating young people towards a better version of the world we currently have, but one that totally disrupts and perhaps rejects a lot of the frames that we've built our civic life upon, and to give ourselves the freedom and creativity and use our literacy practices to take that leap. This is also building on, again, the work that I've been trying to do to break down the boundaries between some of our fields. We know that civic education is still often seen as the domain of social studies educators in schools and often in the research as well. And we know that a lot of the conceptions about what it means to be a good citizen, or the characteristics of acting as a citizen, are things that need to be shaken up, because they are many of the measures that we use to measure civic engagement and to create narratives about who is engaged and who is not are based on measures of civic life that are no longer appropriate for the world in which we are living. So this chart on the left is just some of the things that are still used in large-scale surveys to measure youth civic engagement. And some of these obviously still might be relevant, but a lot of them are not, for lots of socio-political reasons. Union membership for young people is becoming less and less of a reality for many different reasons. The idea of having to think about civic engagement through the lens of political party membership, weird kinds of, like, at the same time that skills are being mentioned here, there are also things like believing people are trustworthy, which again, in a white supremacist and oppressive social context, might not be. Kathy Cohen would argue that for many Black Americans, the idea of trusting other citizens in this country is not a move that would lead to their survival. So I think there's a need to kind of break down a lot of the things that we currently use to argue, for example, that young people are apathetic or not civically engaged. And that's some old work that Ontario and I have done around calling for civic interrogation and innovation about how we define civic life. And again, tearing down the idea that civic engagement begins at 18 with voting or with formal institutions. And then, of course, this all leads into the role of literacies. So there are kind of three elements that we're playing with right now of our speculative civic literacies framework. Again, this is an aspirational framework, so we don't claim that we have achieved this in any of our work. We just see this as these are principles that we are striving for and that we see elements of in some of the work that I'll be talking about in a minute empirically that we've been doing with teachers and with young people around the country. So first, the idea of decentering the neoliberal state in favor of everyday collective civic relations. So we're arguing that we need to flip the entire system on its head. Most civic engagement starts with what our state is currently structured around and asks young people to integrate into them, learn how a bill becomes a law, learn how our structures work and how you can act within them. What if we took those structures down and started with who we are and how we want to live together collectively in an increasingly troubled and turbulent world? And what if we could build structures around that and reject ones that have not been working or that aren't appropriate for the challenges of the 21st century? It also believes in cultivating iterative and reparative civic relations through literacy praxis. And when I use the word reparative, I don't mean that we need to repair something back to the way that it used to be. I'm thinking of Saidiya Hartman and the idea that we can repair towards and otherwise repair towards something new. So how could we have young people engaged in literacy work across differences through things like digital media, practicing over time with each other to move towards a new form of relationship? And then it's also about joy. So joy amid injustice. The news is bombarding us each day with really, really depressing and overwhelming injustice. And what does it mean to bring a sense of joy as we compose futures and continue to dream of a civic otherwise, even amidst struggle, knowing that this is contingent and subversive at all times, and just as the work of activists do, moving with the times to continue the work. So these are the elements that we've been playing with theoretically in our work, and I'm happy to talk more about some of the theories that inform all of this as we go on. But I also wanted to talk about how we're trying to how these came to us through the project that we've been involved in for the past 3 years now and going. And that is through something called the Digital Democratic Dialogue Project, or the 3D Project. We were drawn to the idea of a social design-based experiment, which again flows out of the principles of learning sciences, that our current school systems are not equipped to do the kind of work or to embrace the kinds of principles that we've outlined here. So that doesn't mean that they can't, and we refuse to cede schools to the neoliberal logic. We need to still engage with schools, but to do so in ways that are a little bit more experimental. So that's why we were drawn to the idea of doing something that would take place in school, but also be beyond school, with teachers and students who are navigating the practices of the now, but are also designing toward a hopeful new future. So again, this work has been generously funded by the National Academy of Education and the Spencer Foundation. And the idea of the 3D project is that we brought together 6 teachers from across the nation state of the United States, ranging from Alaska to California to Colorado to Texas to Michigan and Pennsylvania. This was not meant to be representative. Again, this is a learning environment that we designed on a small scale with a little bit of help. And we were trying to do several things with the design of this environment. We did want to have some diversity in terms of geography, because we were interested in the ways that digital media could be used not to simply replicate school the way it's currently been done, but to take what is amazing about digital media, which is the ability to connect across geographic time and space, and let young people who are experiencing very different versions of this American life be able to communicate with each other. So we were able to get, according to census designations, 2 cities, 2 suburbs, and 2 towns. We had a mix of political party affiliation in terms of partisan politics, Republican and Democrat. Within these 6 teachers, we had 235 students engaged in the project, mostly 9 through 12, a few middle school students represented, because one of our teachers taught both middle and high school in the same building. And these are all teachers that were affiliated with the National Writing Project, which I always like to shout out as an amazing professional organization. And that was important to us because, again, we were going into this is a purposeful social design experiment with teachers who are already interested in what it means to, number one, be English teachers invested in civic engagement, because we are trying to still break down the boundaries that social studies is the home of civic engagement. And also teachers who have already been engaged. The writing project has been very much engaged for the past several years now in thinking about what critical civic engagement for youth and teachers look like, and how to use digital media to give young people the chance to express their civic and political opinions. So this was a group that was ready to engage in this kind of dreaming together. And so we were lucky enough with our funding to be able to gather. We started in the summer of 2018 with an in-person retreat to get together and start planning out design cycles. Each of these teachers also were teaching different kinds of classes that had their own requirements associated with them. Some were teaching AP classes, some were teaching elective classes. All of them had the requirements of their school districts, benchmark testing, all the things that teachers and students have to deal with. And we wanted to find a way for them to integrate this project into their curriculum, as opposed to it being something that happened outside of the classroom. Again, because we were interested in showing what might be possible to integrate into school spaces to do this work. So I'm going to just kind of go through the 3 principles a little bit and how we saw them, how we were inspired to create these principles based on some of the work that happened as these young people and teachers across the country engaged in this work. So first, this idea of decentering the state and thinking about the everyday. So when our teachers got together, when we got together in the summer of 2018 to plan 3 design cycles that would go on throughout the school year, we thought about how do you start conversations with young people about civic engagement if you don't want it to start with structures. And they came up with a kind of an essential question that they each wanted to integrate into their practice, which was, who are we as individuals and how are we connected in community? We wanted it to be very broad, and we wanted it to start with them as opposed to starting with the state. And one of the reasons for that is that consistently we find that young people are very, very much invested in political and civic issues. The same things that are hot button issues for adults of voting age in the United States are consistently on the minds of young people. But the difference is that over and over again, we see media and political parties and all the formal establishments not taking their concerns seriously, infantilizing young people, painting them with a broad brush around being disengaged or uninformed or apathetic. And so it's no surprise that for the most part, even though young people describe being very interested in politics, they describe being completely turned off by civics in schools or the idea of civic engagement because of the fact that they can feel that it's not for them. But at the same time that that's happening, I want to point out that like the young people today are not okay in terms of the existential threats that they know are facing them, that they are inheriting from us. In addition to pandemic, we're thinking about issues like gun violence, the kinds of drills they often have to go through in school, climate change. And there's an article that just came out a few days ago that I have posted here. There was a survey done of 10,000 young people across 10 countries around the world. And the idea that young people are experiencing widespread psychological distress right now over the looming climate crisis, seeing the extreme weather events that are happening right now and what is going to continue to happen into their future is creating that sense that, again, there are urgent concerns that are going to affect their very existence moving forward, and that our current systems are just simply not sufficient and not interested in fully addressing them. And that creates a very precarious, but also possible liminal space for young people to reimagine what a civic structure that is responsive might look like. And we asked students at the beginning of the year across all the sites to talk about these issues about civics and what mattered to them. And over again, we saw examples of young people feeling like adults did not want to hear their civic views. So this is one of the students from Pennsylvania said, at my job, one of the state representatives came and he brought all this stuff to give out to people. And then we talked to him afterwards and he was like, yeah, well, thank you guys for helping. And we were like, okay, well, what are you going to do? And he was like, just tell your parents to vote for me. So again, young people are getting the sense very often and clearly that formal political systems are not for them, are not interested in their views, and are not prepared to kind of fully address and take seriously the ideas that they have developed in their developing civic identities. So we wanted to do something different across the sites. And so we first asked students to write introductions to each other. I should also note that in keeping with this kind of experimenting mentality, we were not able to find one digital platform that worked for us to communicate across these 6 sites because of the fact that so many digital platforms are good at certain things, but aren't good at the kind of hybrid, open, free-flowing, but also the kind of communication that young people can engage in that protects their privacy, but also allows them to communicate without the structures of school. So we had to kind of cobble together like all different kinds of tools to get students to communicate with each other. So at this point in the year, we used KQED, a public radio station out of California, had an amazing digital platform for young people to create and share media with each other. And first, we just asked students to introduce themselves to each other using that essential question, who am I as an individual and how are we connected as community? And we were doing some analysis of the 235 introductions that students posted, multimodal introductions that they posted to each other on this site. And at first glance, a lot of the communities that we found that the students focused on in their multimodal essays might seem pretty typical developmentally for adolescents. Family was a very important community for a lot of students in their introductions. Place, like where they were growing up across the country, their friends, their school, their faith. And as we get to some more of these social constructs of race, gender, it might seem like the traditional narrative here is that, yeah, this makes sense. Young people aren't interested in social and political issues in adolescence. They're more focused on inwardly on themselves. But once we got more deeply into what they were actually saying, we were able to draw out the fact that through these everyday relationships, through the everyday communities that mattered to them, the political and socio-political implications were all hovering right below the surface, ready to be explored. So they were talking about politics and they were talking about civics by talking about themselves and about how they interact with each other. So students had the opportunity to comment on each other's multimodal stories and introduce themselves to each other. And they were obviously fascinated by the idea, many young people saying, I have never talked to anyone, a real human being, a real teenager that lives in a community that's so different than my own. So students from Pennsylvania talking to students in Alaska and just reading about their lives, they were fascinated, not just personally and interpersonally, but also because of some of the political issues that wound up coming up. So these are some of the photo essays that students wound up sharing about things that mattered to them, ranging from, you know, their time on social media, anime, the places they live, their interests, sports. And as those things were being shared, students came to ask questions that were about things that were getting into the socio-political. So for example, one of the students in Alaska posted an introduction about her family hunting for food and the role of guns in Alaskan society where she lived, which was a rural area in Alaska. And another student living in Texas said, your story and your situation is very different than anything I ever hear. Just kind of amazed. And I've done like, and the role of guns in someone's life, this wound up being a theme that kind of popped up throughout the entire project for the whole school year, is that guns wound up being a very a prevalent issue on students' minds, which again, we can imagine why in the United States context, and that will come up more as we go through. And said, like, I've never thought about guns this way as something to be used for hunting for food. And the student from Alaska responded, like, I'm not insulted at all by your stance about guns. You live in a completely different area, so by no means should I be offended and not listen to other stances. So just these little moments where the veil was lifted of when we talk a lot of times in our schools around social emotional learning, the idea of getting students to have empathy, to see across difference. That means one thing in the abstract, but it means another for young people to actually be having that interaction with each other around media and across geographic distance. So we were seeing little moments of opening for civic relations that are not based on talking about the state, but are based on talking about personal experience and what it might mean to try to live together across these different personal experiences. So again, this is just for the chat or for you to think about yourself. Whatever field that you are kind of finding your home in as you are doing your research, for me, literacy and civics, doing this experiment helped me to, again, decenter the state and the way that civic scholarship is often valuing the state. So think about your own scholarship, what needs to be decentered, what can be decentered if we have commitments to equity. Going back to that earlier video about not, you know, I know that I don't know what freedom looks like, what frames might we subconsciously be working within that we might want to disrupt or ask ourselves different questions about. And I would shout out my colleague and friend, Shireen Vasoji, who's an amazing researcher who does amazing work in kind of playing out these issues in the learning sciences. So for the second principle, cultivating iterative and reparative civic relations through literacy practice. So as students introduced themselves to each other and they started having these informal political conversations, once they got to know each other and once they felt a certain level of vulnerability and excitement around talking to a real teenager from a different location, only then did we want to introduce the opportunity for them to choose a traditionally civic or political issue that they wanted to talk about with each other and move them into small groups so that they can talk about a particular political issue that mattered to them. And not surprisingly, out of all of our students, the number one issue that had the most students in groups talking about was many of them wanted to talk about guns. Prevalent examples of school shootings and community shootings. We know the role that guns play across the United States. Tara and I are writing another piece about the 3D project completely through the lens of guns because it was such a powerful lens for this whole project. But one of the things they wanted to talk about was guns. So we had them in groups of about 8 to 9 students from across the different sites. And we asked them to engage in dialogue. And we told them, we don't want this to be you are not trying to convince anyone of your point of view. We just want you to share your experience with each other about why this issue matters to you. But this shows very quickly when we started this experiment, and we used Edmodo to do this, because again, we couldn't find lots of platforms that worked for us. We didn't really want to use Edmodo because Edmodo is structured in a lot of ways to mimic the structures of school. But we did use a feature that it had to create groups so that students could join without having to share their private information, because we knew that we were working within schools where it's not always okay for students to share their private information. Of course, on the side, they were all sharing their Instagram handles with each other. So that was all out of our control. But we noticed that the teachers noticed they were kind of troubled by the idea that even with all this prep work around vulnerable dialogue, students kind of immediately, because of the way they've been socialized by school literacies, to write argumentative essays and persuasive essays, and also the ways that they're conditioned by cable news media and our political culture, they could not help themselves, for the most part, of jumping into this conversation and immediately stating claims and using evidence and turning it into a debate. So you see one of the students immediately said, "Hello, everyone, I will be joining you in this debate," even though the original intention was not to kind of tear that down, but so easily students went back into that because that's what we teach as English teachers. So what's your claim? What's your evidence? So one student was saying, we shouldn't talk about gun violence as a big deal because there's been more death from things like stroke and Alzheimer's disease and finding quotes. There's a quote down here that I'm just constantly amazed by. This is actually a quote from Elizabeth Warren back in 2018, I think, 2018 or 19. She said, "We lose 8 children and teenagers to gun violence every day. If a mysterious virus suddenly started killing 8 of our children every day, America would mobilize teams of doctors and public health officials. We would move heaven and earth until we found a way to protect our children, but not with gun violence." And that kind of makes me feel a little sick to my stomach when I look at that quote now, because we're in a situation where we do have young people dying in our country right now because of a mysterious virus. And we're seeing that we're taking the same kind of approach and kind of like a weird death drive around guns to the issues of viruses as well. But teachers were kind of upset by this idea that students were having a hard time moving past the way they were socialized in terms of talking about issues in that kind of argumentative way. So again, we kind of intervened and we helped them to do a little meta-analysis to look at how they had talked to each other and why. And we asked them again to think about how they think they could have a conversation that wasn't in the form of a debate. And they determined again that talking about personal storytelling would be the way to get past talking points and into some kind of vulnerable sharing. So the same group that started out having this kind of like back and forth ping-ponging of quotes and evidence, then got into kind of a more personal photo essay about the role of guns in their own life. So one student from California, living in rural Northern California, posted a picture of his porch, and he said, "I left my gun on the porch and it didn't kill anybody." And there was a student in Pennsylvania who saw that picture and was just kind of like blown away. Again, like talked to his teacher about the fact that he had never seen guns being a normalized part of someone's life. It was just a totally different way of thinking. And he wanted to share with the student his experience with guns, which was about community violence, and the fact that he did not have the same experience of guns. And I don't want to give a kumbaya narrative here, like everyone saw each other's stories and then came to like some kind of grand political realization that changed their entire civic identity development. But what we do see is that there was meaningful conversation that happened across sites as young people started to say like, whoa, I have never experienced, I can't imagine how my political views might be shaped if this was my life. And what does it mean that we all live in one political body that has to make decisions when we all have such different experiences? And for a moment, the veil was kind of lifted. There were moments of vulnerability and empathy, and there was a hint of what it could mean to learn together towards something different. And one of the students from Texas that was part of that group said it was kind of surreal because it's kind of like, hey, there are people out there outside of you, and there are people that exist and have lives and have experiences that aren't you. And that's kind of weird to think about because our life is us. It's always what we've experienced and what we've known. And rarely do people get to go out and experience other people's lives. So seeing that these other people and reading about the experiences they've had, it's very eye-opening. So I think that's a very teenager way of talking about some really sophisticated learning and cognition that's going on, of stepping outside of personal experience, thinking about perspective taking and what that might mean for civic life. So again, there's these almost moments. And again, again, we don't want to act like this was like, it changed everything for anyone. There are many things that were influencing students' civic identities, their families, their communities, but there was something going on in the form of personal storytelling that was an almost moment. And I want you to think about the almost moments in your own work when that veil seems to be lifted that could reveal a different kind of reality. How do we document this? How do we document the cultural and cognitive dimensions of speculative learning? Ontario and I are working on a new book right now, and for Norton, and it's called Civics for the World to Come. And the question that we're trying to ask is, how do we educate students for the skills and knowledge they will need to navigate a world that is not yet. And so I think we're really playing with this idea of what do we need to know and be able to do to plan for a world that we have not even yet created. And the reason that I say that this is, again, important to do this is a joyful moment. We had amazing moments together as a community, but important to also recognize that this is happening amidst continued injustice. So just as students were really starting to get to this moment of sharing these personal photo essays and having these vulnerable conversations, as the school year was going on, all of a sudden, two things happened. First, there were students who began to share the impact of gun violence in their communities or against them and their families personally. So students talked about experiencing gun violence, especially in Colorado, where we know we've heard a lot of events over the years, from Columbine to Aurora, and some students have been affected by all of those events. At the same time in Colorado, a shooting occurred in the community. So a student at another school nearby was killed, and the community was reeling. And then some of you might remember, there was a moment at the anniversary of the Columbine shooting in 2019 when all of the schools in the Denver metro area, all K-12 schools, were shut down. So no one came to school because of the fact that someone had flown into the area who was possibly infatuated with Columbine, and they couldn't find this person, and they were worried about threats to the school. So all students didn't go to school. So again, we talk about schooled civic learning and how we want students to learn how to be engaged civically. But students are getting real civic learning by literally not going to school because of fears of mass shootings happening around them. And that's a much more powerful form of civic learning than anything we could tell young people about. And we could talk forever about how difficult it's been to create any kind of political change around guns for lots of reasons. But what was really powerful about this is it was really crushing for the students, because right when they were getting to a point where they were sharing, all of a sudden the Colorado students kind of dropped out of the conversation. And the teacher from Colorado was reflecting at the end of the year. My class got so excited about the Zoom calls, because we also started getting our students on Zoom calls so they could see each other live on video. My class got so excited about the Zoom calls and imagining something with a big group of people from all over the country. But after everything, they were just like, can we just finish the school year? I don't want to do this anymore. And I think that this moment of exhaustion and despair is real. As if we're going to be doing this work, if we're going to open up this portal, then we have to be ready for what we're going to find. And the fact that young people, like we talked about earlier, are literally fearing for their lives, either viscerally, immediately, or in the long term, when we talk about things like climate change. And what does it mean to honor that and to hold that as educators? Our teachers talked a lot about sharing this quote with their students from Angela Davis. It takes a lot of work to say, you have to act as if it were possible to radically transform the world, and you have to do it all the time. And what does that actually mean to put into practice is something the teachers were struggling with. And they were also struggling with the verb tenses here. So you have to act as if it were possible to radically transform the world. They asked, does that mean that it is possible, or that we just wish that it were? And that was a really deep question for them to be thinking about with their students, and to be real about the fear that a lot of them had about how to answer that. I'll stop talking in a moment because I want to get to conversation. But I did want to mention that there's a whole other talk we could do about the teachers in this work. So after the first school year, after the 2018-19 school year, we were lucky enough to come together in a physical space, the teachers, to talk about what this process had been like, and to talk about the multiple activity systems that were operating during the 3D project. So in addition to the design cycles that we had planned for the school year, there were things going on in their classrooms, in their schools, in the lives of their students, and international and national politics. A huge earthquake hit Alaska, the events we talked about in Colorado, and all of these different events were all part of how this project mattered for the teachers in this project. And one of the last things we did ask students to do before the school year ended was to play with this idea of superheroes, civic superheroes. So as they were feeling kind of drained and tired of the world that we currently have, we encouraged them to play with the world that could be. And this is one of the students from Michigan, developed a superhero named Homegirl. Homegirl has the power to create homes and take families off the street. And all the students came up with, we had students coming up with superheroes that dealt with issues around immigration, around issues of climate change. And some would argue that this form of literacy is not civic learning because it's just dreaming, right? And it's just fun, but this doesn't help us to actually do anything about the challenges that we're currently facing with current policy. But again, our model would argue that if you start with the dreams first, and then you work your way backwards to what is currently possible and why can't we enact some of our dreams, it could lead to some really generative thinking and questioning that could change what we currently see around us. So again, the teachers, this, I can't stress enough, like how this turned into a family. The 3D project we also thought about in this work, if you do this kind of work, it begs the question of when does research begin and when does it end? And does it end? And we determined that being part of a group like this, we don't end this. This is not the end of a research project. So the Spencer funding might end after a year, but the 3D project lives on. So we've been still working together. We go through peaks and valleys. The pandemic was really hard, but we meet every month and we cry together and we talk together and we are a family together. We're on our constant text thread and Slack channel. And to think about what it means to be engaged in this kind of work for the long haul and to truly be in community with each other. I did not think this research group would really be a community. I didn't see any way my future was really bound up with anybody else's when we started, but each teacher broke something open in me in a way I'd forgotten I could feel. And we write together now. We have a new piece out that was written in collaboration with the teachers because doing this work is healing for them. And I could talk more about the structures later, but I'll just end on this note of the quote for the quote that we named this article after was a survey that we did at the end of the year with the students. We asked them how they felt about being part of the project for the year and how they saw their civic future. And one of the students said, "I hesitate, but I do have hope." And I think that kind of captures the sense of fear and uncertainty, but the determination to move forward. And if you're not familiar with Woke Kindergarten and IKEA, they do amazing work with young learners. I think young learners are often our most radical learners. And back when the election was happening, the presidential election, and many people were just really stressed about what the future of our country would hold, and there was a lot of cynicism and doubt, they gave us a great reminder that if you work with young people, we don't have the luxury of being cynical. If you work with young people, we must have hope, and we must be imagining these worlds because that is our imperative. So I'll stop there because I'd be curious to hear more about what this is making you think about. But thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Nicole. This was amazing. I'm going to open it up for question. I have one of my own, but I don't want to abuse my privileges. So go ahead. Anybody else with questions? And you can also put them in the chat if you would prefer that. All right, fine. I will abuse my privileges. So, you know, I was very compelled by the notion of joy and joy through resistance, and that quote, you know, towards the end of how the youth were exhausted by having to hear and deal and work through these issues. And I'm curious how and in what ways you brought in, or you thought about or had discussions with you and the team about ways to bring in joy or to surface that joy in these difficult times.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the joy had to be built in from the very beginning. So when we all got together, I mentioned first I had to start with the teachers, because then the students really fed off of the connections between the teachers and then connected with each other. That first summer before we got started in the school year, we did an activity that I literally didn't even think that much about. I do this activity a lot with young people when I start a new school year. An iceberg activity. So some of you might have done this if you teach. This idea of an iceberg is that, you know, only 10% of an iceberg can be seen above the surface of the water, and 90% of an iceberg is underwater. And connecting that to our identities, that we often make assumptions about people when we meet them based on the 10% that we think we can see, when really there's so much more to us. And young people, I often do this activity where that's an icebreaker, where they share more about what's under the surface that people wouldn't know about you just by looking at you. And I did that with the teachers to start our conversation together, because even though that we were all part of the writing project family, they didn't necessarily know each other that well. We just kind of knew each other on a professional level. And I didn't think about it at the time, but that activity became the most foundational. Like, they still talk about it to this day, about how that's how we started our joyful and loving relationships with each other, is just treating them as full human beings in this work, and letting them talk about who they were vulnerably with each other. And that spirit then translated into the ways that we kept talking about care. We weren't afraid to talk about care and love with our students. And then they're teenagers, so they loved the Zoom calls. That, you know, there is an element of digital pen pals. Like, it got to stuff that was much deeper, but they found joy out of just like being able to talk to each other about silly stuff, and encouraging them that that's part of the journey as well. We don't need to feel sad or cynical all the time to express how much we care about issues. And we learn that from young people. We learn that from the struggle and the history of organizing. So that was one of the ways that we kind of kept trying to bring that back, even when things that were really heavy were happening.
Aaron?
Yeah, it's really great, Nicole. I'm very interested in the special issue as well and hearing more about that. I was curious if in your sort of developing of the speculative civic model, in engaging with young people, do you feel like you've developed some sense of like how they